My name is Dan Vito. This is Fireborn Studios, and I'm going to do a little video on specific gravity, which can help you to get your glazes to the thickness that you want them to be. So if you don't have your glazes to the right thickness, then when you apply them to your pots, they could be too thick or too thin. I personally like to have my glazes set so that when I dip a pot in the glaze and hold it there for 1 to 2 seconds, I've got about the right amount of glaze on it. So what is the right amount of glaze? Well, this is a Kemper needle tool, and the needle part here is about the thickness of the coat of glaze that I want on a pot. And I can check the thickness of the glaze on a pot by, after dipping it, and when it's dry, I can scratch through the glaze and I can see how thick it is. So I would say this is on the thick side here, this needle. Now, you need to know what looks good on your pots with your glazes and whether you want your glazes to be thinner than this or thicker than this. And that's something you just have to figure out. But once you figured it out, you should try to be consistent so that you get good results all the time. And if you don't have the glazes the right thickness, bad things can happen. So these are some of the bad things that can happen. In the firing, the glazes can crawl, which means they kind of separate and leave a bare spot on your pot. That's crawling, and it happens in the kiln when the glazes are molten before you turn the kiln off. Settling out is another issue. If you have the glazes in the bucket and they settle out a whole lot, and you have a whole lot of water on the top, and they're hard to stir, and after you stir them, they settle really quickly. That's a problem because you have to continually stir them. Sometimes they can settle out and do what's called hard panning, which means they get like a rock on the bottom of the bucket, and you literally need to take a screwdriver and chisel the glaze off the bottom of the container, and then you can stir it up and it will become a liquid again, but sometimes within 5 minutes it settles out and hard pans again on the bottom. Another issue that you can have if your glazes aren't set right is after you dip your pot in the glazes can start to peel back as they dry or flake off or crack, and they don't adhere to the clay. That can also be due to having dirt and dust on your pots, but if they're not set properly with the right water content, you can get the same defect. Okay, so those are some of the things that can go wrong. Now, some things that you can do if your glazes are settling out is you can add Epsom salts, and that usually works pretty good. This changes the pH of the glaze and causes it to deflocculate, and this is probably more than I would need for a 5-gallon bucket of glaze. Yeah, so it's not a whole lot. And when I mix up a 5-gallon bucket, I mix up 13,000 grams, which takes me pretty close to the top. Some people only mix 10,000 grams, but you know, it doesn't take any longer to mix 13,000 grams, and then I don't have to mix it as often. What else? You can also put bentonite in the glaze. If you're going to put bentonite in the glaze, though, you should put the bentonite in by adding it to the dry mix before you stir up the dry mix and add the water. And when I mix glazes, I have a bucket of dry mix on the floor, and I use this mixer to stir the dry mix. And then I take these and I put in about 4 of these. These are 64 ounces. And I stir it some more. And at that point, it's going to be pretty lumpy. And I just keep stirring full speed and adding pitchers of water until it starts to look like a glaze. I want it to be on the thick side, and typically it'll take 6 or 5, 6, 7 of these to get it to the right, to get it to behave like a glaze, to get it so that I can pass it through a 60 or a 70 mesh screen, actually. So I can get it to pass through. Ultimately, I want it to go through an 80. So I've got a 30, a 60, and an 80. I want it to go through the 80. Sometimes I start with a 30, but I want it to go through an 80 eventually. Okay, so that's the glaze mixing. I add the water to the dry powder and I stir the dry powder first. Now, a given volume of glaze is heavier than water, and that's what this is about. If you have 2 containers that are the same size and you have the same amount of glaze in them, water in this one and glaze in that one, the glaze is going to be heavier. So, the weight of the water is not equal to the weight of the glaze. The glaze is going to be heavier. When you use a container, you have to have the precise, because we're going to compare these two things. We're going to compare this weight with that weight. We're going to use a scale. And this kind of container isn't very good because it's wide and it's hard to get a good reading of precisely how much is in there. But something like this or this is excellent because they're skinny here, and a slight difference in the volume of the glaze is going to immediately read on this. So when I use this, I make a little mark, and my mark is kind of faded, but I have a piece of tape here, and I fill it exactly to this point, and that gives me a measured volume. And I can fill this with water, and I can weigh the water. I can fill it with the glaze, and weigh the glaze, and then I will know exactly what the difference is, and I can calculate the specific gravity. But a much easier way to do this is with a graduated cylinder, which is exactly 100 milliliters, because 100 milliliters equals 100 grams weight-wise. Water, 100 millimeters equals 100 grams. And glaze is going to be heavier. I don't even need to fill this with water because I know what it weighs, but I'll just do it for the heck of it. Here's some water. First thing I'm going to do is, well, we'll leave this dry. So I can put this on here, turn on the scale, and let's see. If I just turn on the scale, it's going to read 0. If I put this on here, it's going to read 41 grams, which is the weight of that. But if I press this tare button, it's going to go back to 0. So now it's canceled out the weight of the container. If I take the container off, it says it's minus 41. Okay, so when I fill this thing with 100 milliliters of water, it's going to weigh 100 grams. Okay, so what happens when I put 100 milliliters of glaze in here? So I just stirred this glaze with my electric mixer a moment ago, but I'm going to just stir it again a little bit. Okay, I'm going to fill this thing up to 100 milliliters. Okay, I'm going to put it on the scale, and it was still reading negative 41. So this says 165.8 grams. And to change that 165.8 into specific gravity, I just move the decimal place over to here, and the specific gravity of this glaze is 1.65. Okay, that's the specific gravity. And what that means is that this glaze is 1.65 times heavier than an equal volume of water. So if whatever number I get here is going to indicate how much heavier it is than 100 grams. And because we're working with 100, it's perfect. So I've got a 500 milliliter graduated cylinder, but I'd have to do some math to come up with a specific gravity. But as long as I'm using a 100 milliliter graduated cylinder, that works perfectly. Now, I know that these are different. This glaze is particularly heavy, and I want it to be heavy. I want it to be thick. You can see that it's almost like pancake batter. But some of my glazes are closer to, the thickness of milk. Typically, a glaze is about the thickness of heavy cream. But it depends on your glaze. It depends on, you have to learn your glazes. You have to know how they behave, and you've got to figure out how thick you want them to be. And once you figure it out, this method will enable you to get the right amount of water consistently in your glaze. But the specific gravity number is very useful. Sometimes when you buy glazes from a store and you get them in a bag and they're dry and they're powdered, you can find out from the manufacturer what the specific gravity should be. So this is a list that Standard Ceramics provides, and these are all the different glazes, and this is the product number of the glaze. This is the specific gravity that they recommend you set it at, and this is how much water you would add to a pound of glaze to get it to that specific gravity. So on some of them you're adding 14 ounces of water per pound, and others 16 or 13 or whatever, and that should give you these specific gravities. And you may not agree with this after you mix them up. You may decide you like them thinner or thicker, but this is a good starting point. And you can see that most of these glazes, in fact all these glazes, are between 1.55 and 1.4. And my glaze over here was 1.65, so my glaze was totally off the chart compared to the glazes Standard makes. But nevertheless, I want it thick because this glaze is a very fluid glaze and it's a very runny glaze, and I want it to run down from the top of the pot and stop before it runs off the bottom. You can't use this glaze on the bottom of the pot because it'll run on the shelf every time. You can only use it on the upper part of a pot or on the inside. And it's a gorgeous glaze. But you need to know how to use it, and you need to know how to set it. And when I set my glazes, I don't use specific gravity, and I don't use this graduated cylinder. I just stick my hand in and wiggle it around and pull my hand out, and I look at my hand, and I do it totally by feel, but I've been doing this for 50 years. And if you don't have a feel for it, specific gravity is a good starting point. Let's see, did I cover everything? Yeah, I think we're good.